Now, Mick Lynch has been in the news quite a lot recently. I've covered so much of him on my channel, it's unreal, because he is the Giga Chad. Let's be absolutely real. He is the Giga Chad of the Labour movement right now. He's part of the Enough is Enough campaign that I've covered on my channel too, and he seems to be the only person in in the country really who can properly speak a kind of socialist message on these platforms because he doesn't really care about being given a media platform. All he wants to do is come on there, be straight talking, be sincere, and I think that's resonating with a lot of people, which is good. Like, I mean, he's clearly been incredibly effective in breaching, putting the message to people overall, which is really great. Now, the issue that people have with Mick Lynch, right? The Liberals were all on side with him when he was saying his stuff on the BBC, but then he committed the cardinal sin. He said that he voted for Brexit, and now a bunch of Liberals are going, "Well, I liked you when you were talking about left wing politics, right? But now I know that you supported Brexit. The workers can go fuck themselves. What? These are all the shit libs on Twitter, all like. 'Cause I think most people don't really care about his positions on on the EU. They mostly really only care about his positions with regards to fighting for workers' rights. But I digress. Either way, James O'Brien is kind of king of the follow back pro EU people on Twitter, king of the Ramonas, right? Now, full disclosure, I don't support Brexit. I think that we should have remained in the European Union. I disagree with Mick Lynch, and we'll probably get to the crux of my disagreements in this next segment. But the level to which that Brexit is such an issue that people are going to get over obsessed with, especially the FBP crowd, so much so that they're willing to essentially can the movement for better rights for workers, to fight specifically over this wedge issue that they've kind of put their mast into, I find incredibly frustrating. I just disagree about Brexit and agree with workers' rights and just leave it Brexit. I mean, Brexit's happening, right? You're not going to turn it round. You're going to stop Brexit. Let's forget about that and let's move on to fixing what we actually can fix. But I digress. Either way, James O'Brien is challenging Mick Lynch on his EU views in this LBC segment, and I can critique both sides of this discussion as somebody who has sympathies each way, who does believe that we should have remained a member of the European Union myself. But nevertheless, let's watch the segment and we can critique it from there.
Colin is in Windsor. Colin, what would you like to ask Mick?
Good morning, James. Good morning, Mick. And Mick Lynch, fantastic work. I've been so impressed with what you've done over the last few months.
Thank you.
Based.
My question is, do you believe that British workers' rights will be enhanced or weakened by us leaving the EU?
Well, in terms of the most of the legislation that we've got that is not inherited from the EU, it's mainly the Working Time Directive, which we implemented as a 48-hour week, would you believe? So it's a very diluted version of what come. But it's up to the government at Westminster whether they want to change those laws. All of the laws that we had inside the EU are now written in, copied straight into British legislation. So if you want to change any of those laws for better or worse, you now have a sovereign right to do that. If you're in the EU, you can't. But if you take the last Corbyn manifesto, which I obviously support, it's likely that that manifesto was illegal under the European Union because you cannot go to public ownership of the leading parts of the economy, the railways, energy, and the rest of it.
What have they just done in France with EDF?
Well, they've used an
I've not specifically seen any particular law in the books that means that nationalisation is impossible whilst within the European Union. Again, as James has pointed out, the French government have been able to buy out the rest of the shares in these particular governments. There are plenty of people who are within the European Union who are also who may not even be in the EU, but be part of EFTA or the single market, who have been able to do these kind of nationalizations or have these huge kind of public spheres, sectors of the economy. But also with regards to the idea that workers' rights were being eroded outside of Brexit, now Mick is 100% correct in saying that those laws are still part of our rule book at the moment. And then you have to get someone else to come in and change them if you want to, and that depends on the government that's in charge. The issue that I have, and the issue I think most people do have with regards to that, who are possibly on the left, who are socialists, who do think that remaining in the European Union was a net more positive than leaving, especially at that time with the Conservatives in charge, is that the issue is that you run the risk. Right, you run the risk of them being stripped later. When you're in the European Union, you cannot change them unless it is through the European Parliament. No matter who is in charge in the UK, they have to adhere to that, right? And that's why we're getting this race to the bottom that Mick Lynch was obviously describing, as we saw previously, with regards to Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak essentially wanting to turn us into the sweatshop of Europe, right? I'm definitely going to cover the issues of the charter cities and free ports and this idea that they want to have these tax-free areas with literally zero protections for workers, which are very, very scary. I'm definitely going to cover that in a future segment, right? And by leaving the European Union, you leave that door open, right? Obviously, the people to blame specifically are the Conservatives wanting to repeal those laws. But if we had stayed in the European Union, even if they wanted to and they had a huge mandate to repeal those laws, they literally could not, because it's part of what we signed up to join the European Union. Again, this is a case of perspective, and I think that it's not worth the risk. And we're now seeing that played out in real time with the kinds of stripping of workers' rights that are being planned by Sunak and Truss.
Emergency power to cap it. The EDF was already
But within the bounds of EU legislation.
Yeah, they have. But if you take, they haven't got round to the energy. The fourth railway package that was brought in by the EU means that all railway services have to be subject to privatisation, and they're doing that in France, Germany, Italy, and Spain right now.
So there is more wiggle room than perhaps some of your arguments allowed.
There may be wiggle room, but the French and Germans tend to interpret what they do more liberally than we do.
Yeah, but they're members of the same institution. So
Yeah,
the
but
RMT's position is driven, because a lot of people are very interested in this. It's driven by the conviction that you couldn't have a programme of full renationalisation under European Union.
Yeah, and I don't think you
legislation.
can. So certainly the railways could not be taken.
But I'm pretty sure that that's not true. And maybe it's true for some other sectors, but it's definitely, I don't think that's true for the railway specifically. When we have a nationalised company, we nationalise rail track, right, which goes to pay for, which organise all the infrastructure of the rail networks. And what we actually have isn't actually a private company that runs the railways. We have private franchises that are leased by the government to run the railways, right? Where you could just let those franchising contracts run out. Actually, that happened during the pandemic, and the government took control of the profit and loss of the railways during the pandemic, because they knew they were never going to make a loss, to protect the revenues of the private companies. If you just let all of these franchise agreements run out and then didn't renew them, there would still be the ability for nationalisation to come in afterwards. And I think that Mick is being pretty sly in the way that he's purporting these things, right? I mean, sure, full nationalisation, the movements are the Socialist Republic of Great Britain, or the Socialist Republic of England and Wales, more likely, in a kind of future socialist utopia Britain, right? We would need to leave the EU to do that. But was this the right time? I don't think so. And you just unilaterally leave later if you really wanted to.
Into public ownership, or they can only be taken temporarily into public ownership under the fourth railway package. And those packages are going to be brought to all public services. And things like the free movement of labour, which many people appreciate, and I'm not against people moving to get a job, but it also means that you have to inherit the terms and conditions that are brought. So you had what was called the Viking Laval case, where Lithuanian workers were posted into Scandinavia and they brought Lithuanian wages, which obviously undermines the local market. So there are problems about
But again,
free movement of labour and capital that undermine collective agreements.
We're not going to get.
But I also think, I mean, to be fair, he was specifically talking about like the agreements that have an undercutting and things like that too. But actually, immigrant workforces do tend to be more more unionised than native workforces, at least in the UK. And Marx's understanding of immigrants as the reserve army of labour is kind of being debunked now from studies that we do have about the effect of immigration on wages. So I wouldn't agree on like the idea of like the free labour market undermining workers in the sense that Mick slightly is alluding to it. I kind of disagree.
Into a half an hour ding dong about this,
No.
but you're cherry picking again. I mean, there are plenty
Well,
of.
everyone does that.
Well,
Arguments, don't they,
but
Jim?
some people think you're a refreshing change, Mick Lynch. You can't use the everybody does it defence.
No, but
you
that's-
can't seriously look at what's happened since 2016 and not regret in part.
I do regret
The
that,
Brexit vote.
that there is a Conservative government bringing
What were you
through...
expecting?
Well, we were asked in principle, weren't we?
Yes.
Do you approve of the European Union, and do you want to remain a member of it? My position is the traditional left position, going back to Peter Shaw and Michael Foot.
Lexit.
Lexit, if you want to call it that. If we'd had the European Community, the EEC, I would have voted to stay in the EEC. I don't personally, and many people in my union don't believe that Europe should be a sovereign country. I don't believe in a European army, which will come.
No, it won't.
Well, the European Union isn't a sovereign country they make. Like, I also have my doubts about the European army, which they said there wasn't one on the way, and it looks like there may be the intimations of that happening soon, right? I think my main real issue, right? I agree with the two people I agree with regards to the European Union. The first one is Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who essentially wants to maintain membership of the European Union, but the withdrawal of some of the economic treaties are the kind of things that Mick Lynch is talking about here, that make it difficult to pass socialist legislation whilst maintaining membership on a kind of diplomatic level. Because what Zizek says, who's the other person I agree with on this issue, is that we are facing global issues, issues that are not, which are not going to be isolated within individual countries. So it's going to take huge amounts of international cooperation to solve these issues moving forward, because we're literally looking at pretty substantial threats to the world at large in general, right? And if the international community doesn't find ways of maintaining some kind of united front to be able to fix these issues through large-scale diplomatic agreements, like, for example, the European Union, there's going to be too much, protectionist sentiment going on that's explicitly trying to make sure that the buck always gets passed on to somebody else. In the same way, at the moment, we're getting people going, we shouldn't have to do anything about climate change because China isn't. Whereas if we had large-scale international cooperation, like we had on, for example, on the ban on CFCs that helped with the ozone layer issues that we were having, that took a huge amount of international cooperation, the Kyoto Protocols, and the European Union existing as a diplomatic entity really helps us do that. They're also pretty good with regards to their issue on kind of monopolies and their ability to be able to they've halted huge numbers of mergers, fined companies for breach of their competition laws, which I think is good. Like, that's definitely something that the European Union does well. We're not going to get with the Conservative government we have right now. We're losing those protections. Again, I understand it's a nuanced issue, but that's just my point of view.
Let's see. I don't believe.
What's wrong with armies that we're in?
I don't-
There's armies that we're not in that we're supposed to be worried about historically.
Possibly. I don't believe that we should give up much of our fiscal policy to a European state. I was in Ireland at the weekend seeing family, and mortgages are going up in Ireland because of the decisions of the European Central Bank in France.
We've got the highest inflation in the G7.
Yes, we have.
Largely because of Brexit. Even the Wall Street Journal, which leans to the right, says so.
Well, I saw an economist say it's 50% to do with the oil
Yeah,
and gas.
all right, and 48% to do with Brexit.
Well, possibly, and that's a consequence. But
Would you go back in if they gave us the option?
we can consider having a relationship with Europe on a better basis than we're going to get, certainly. And if it was the EEC, I would certainly support it.
I should go back to.
I think what I really want to understand, though, is the position on things like single market, EFTA, and the customs union, right? Because you'd think, right, with Mick Lynch having such ties to Ireland, that he wouldn't want to see the Good Friday Agreement put under the threat of the issues that happen by withdrawing from a lot of these trade agreements, or with these agreements with regards to what happens on the Irish border. Because we don't want to see the start of the troubles again, which is what we're going to get with the Brexit that we have now if we get rid of the Northern Ireland Protocol as it currently exists. Or it's possibly he does sees accelerationist in this regard and thinks that, well, by compromising the current agreement that we do have that maintains the United Kingdom as is, by stoking up the issues with regards to the Good Friday Agreement, it could lead to a future United Ireland. I'm like, don't know how I feel about, whether it's worth the potential side effects of that, but I do believe in United Ireland at the very least, or at least Northern Irish self-determination, but that's a bit of a digression. And if he believes that the European Union as it exists with the UK being involved with it is something that, or being a member rather, is something that jeopardizes future Irish unity, maybe that's a position he has, I don't know. But for me, personally, I think that the risks that Brexit has posed to the Northern Ireland peace process is very dangerous.
Colin, because I've got on my hobby horse now. Colin, are you satisfied with that answer?
No, not particularly, because I did hear.
Okay, that's fair enough.
Sorry, Mick.
I accept that.
Thanks, Paul. Mick Truss, Liz Truss, and Richie Sunak both said they want to scrap every single piece of EU legislation that's on the books. So,
yeah, but our employment laws don't sit in EU legislation. So the anti-trade union laws
they provide the base, though.
Yeah,
but they can go below the base now. You know this.
Yeah, but anti-union laws are not anything to do with the EU legislation. They come mainly.
He's not talking about the anti-union laws. He's talking about protections that are enshrined in law, which does reflect the EU, but they're promising to rip up everything that was inherited from the EU, which is going to make the situation for British workers immeasurably worse.
So we need to get rid of this government. And
get
a better government.
You shouldn't have voted to give them the power to do it, man.
Well, no, they would have the power to do it anyway, because the deal that they were. Let's not forget that Cameron was elected on a basis of renegotiating the relationship with Europe. So the only way they wouldn't have had the referendum was to get some of those freedoms anyway, which is what Cameron was elected for.
Maybe.
I mean, not necessarily, though. Like, that's a bit of what if. kind of creating a headcanon here, Mick, about what bits of EU legislation would have been on the table. I mean, it's very possible that it would have been workers' rights, knowing the Tories, and might be one of the things that's a bargaining chip. But I don't think the EU would have ceded to that. That's the issue that I have. So potato, potato, I guess.
Back to Colin. Sorry, I said I was not going to eat your lunch, and I just did.
Aye, okay. Sorry, Mick, I'm in total
sorry,
disagreement with about EU.
Yeah, that's part of democracy.
There's a golden rule in life. Never trust a Tory, and they are going to demolish every workers' right they can possibly think of, and ones that we even haven't.
And you waved it through.
I waved it as passing by, perhaps. Look, we didn't believe in the EU. We never did. Some of us who have socialist-leaning, socialist backgrounds. The priority for me is not to undo history, but to get...
remember, he is correct in saying that the European Union, in its essence, is a neoliberal project. All right, an ability to try and further globalize trade, to further use the power of the kind of new global north economic powerhouse that it exists to be able to continue the imperial pipelines of value extraction from the global south and use that to make benefit for the whole of the European community, right? Now, that is one of the things that I firmly disagree with, but whether or not we're a member of that, that's still going to happen, and us leaving has only made the European Union stronger. Yeah, exactly. I can see where he's coming from. I don't necessarily think that he's making bad points here. I just disagree because so much of this is subjective too. But again, as I said, things like, for example, like my opinion on things like NATO as well is that I think NATO should be disbanded, but whilst it still exists, why should the UK leave? It doesn't make any sense for us to leave. It's still going to be it's still going to function in the same imperialist capacity, whether or not the UK is a part of it or not. So by staying a member, it makes it easy. We can push the movement to change the direction. So I don't think that it's worth leaving the European Union and NATO as it exists currently, because it'll still exist afterwards with the same remit, right? Why should all those benefits go specifically to the European Union at the same rate when we could be part of that and protect our own workers' rights? That's my point.
Get a different government that's going to strengthen employees' rights. And if I look at what's happening in seafaring, we've had British ratings destroyed while we've been in the EU, and there's not one piece of EU legislation that would have brought back British seafarers.
How many French P&O workers were chucked out without notice by P&O?
But they were a few, but they were not under it's not covered by EU legislation. It's covered by the international.
A lot of Irish people telling me their mortgages haven't gone up.
Well, they will be going.
I mean, he's right, and he's also Mick is 100% correct here. And in or out of the EU, P&O would have been able to do what they did. Well, it's an incredibly nuanced issue. It's incredibly nuanced issue. And again, I think the issue now is, regardless of what his previous position on Brexit was, we spend so much time, especially fucking on Twitter with fucking liberals, talking about whether people voted to leave or not, and whether we should go back in. No, it's happened now. Let's leave people's previous allegiances towards leave or remain in the past, and talk about the best way that we can get what has to happen first, which is the UK leaving the European Union. That has to happen in the best way possible, in the best negotiated terms possible. And that's what we need to talk about. We need to agitate for staying in the customs union, to protect the Irish border and to make sure we don't restart the Troubles. That's the main issue that I have. We spend so much time in our little camps over Brexit, over hard Brexit versus complete Remain. We forget that clearly there needs to be some kind of compromise here to move things forward. Otherwise, we'll completely forget about the important stuff that Mick Lynch does, like fighting for workers' rights, fighting for better pay for his own memberships, talking about the issues with regards to macroeconomic direction of our own government, rather than spending time spinning the tires around the Brexit issue, which won't get solved by being like, we have to have hard Brexit, we have to leave. We need to actually find pragmatic solutions whereby we can achieve some Brexit of some description, some fucking red, white, and blue Brexit, right? But be able to maintain things that matter, such as ability for businesses to thrive with some kind of future trade agreement with the European Union, and also to make sure that the sanctity of the Good Friday Agreement remains intact, which at the moment is the biggest issue that I have with Brexit currently, is the issue with the Good Friday Agreement that is, which could lead to, war, death That's something that everyone can agree is bad. So that we need pragmatic solutions to these now. And talking about what Mick Lynch thought about Brexit in 2016, that does nothing. It helps nobody, especially not the RMT members or people who want to advocate for progressive change. This is Mick Lynch, North Countryman. He's a union leader in the UK.
I know, because we're going to put the interest rates up.
Take some news, and then we'll get back to the phones. I'm glad that we've lanced the Brexit boil. A lot of complaints when you came off full disclosure, but it's not.
But it's nice to know that even against somebody who he knows voted Brexit, James O'Brien can at least have this discussion. Whereas for so much time, James O'Brien gets incredibly frustrating when he just gets angry with Brexit people and just talks down to them. And he could have just, talk to people normally like he did with Mick Lynch there and treated them with your basic levels of respect, which for a lot of his guests he just doesn't do, which is unfortunate. But overall, I disagree with Mick Lynch on the Brexit issue. I understand his point of view. But I've laid out my case in response, and I know I'm going to title this video "Was Mick Lynch Wrong About Brexit?" in huge fucking letters, like a clickbait title. But that's for you. I've laid out my point of view. Mick Lynch has already posted his point of view there as well. It's up to you, dear viewers, for you to decide whether you think that he or I are correct on this issue, or maybe you have another particular. Maybe you are someone who is heavily Remain and you think we're both idiots, but whatever. But if you did enjoy the content, please do comment, like, and subscribe. If you click the bell, it'll notify you when I go live. And if you follow me on my little socials there, I also now have the ability for you to join me on Patreon or subscribe on Twitch, which will get you emotes and you will feel less bad for having my content for free. But I'll catch you on the next one, future YouTube viewers.